Very much, Alexandra. Our next session is titled Forward from Findings. We hope this session will serve to further ground us all at the same starting point. What do we already know about the health effects of climate change? Where are the immediate opportunities to lessen them? And how should we all be thinking about future research, innovations, and investments as we move to build sustainable and resilient health systems? Let's start by considering what we can do right now to protect and improve health around the world, even as we address the root cause of climate change. How specifically do we unlock what Dr. Neira called the co-benefits to health that we could experience right now by taking immediate climate actions? To help get specific about those co-benefits and how and where some of them might occur, we invited a very distinguished professor who has been working at the intersection of climate and health for decades now. Jonathan Patz is John P. Holden Endowed Chair of Health and Environment at the University of Wisconsin. Since it's about 2 in the morning in Madison, Professor Patz recorded his short lecture for us a couple of days ago, and we'll watch it now.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to first thank the organizers of the Forecasting Healthy Futures Conference and thank them especially for allowing me to present virtually. So I'm going to be covering, let me share my screen here, I'm going to be covering pretty much the health co-benefits of decarbonizing, so why fossil fuel futures can save millions of lives. So I'm going to dive in here. And as a reminder, we all know that burning fossil fuels emits greenhouse gases that are warming the planet, and we have rising temperatures, sea level rise, and extremes of the water cycle. And we know the many pathways through which these climate extremes affect our health. All of us in this meeting know this. And that the climate crisis is a health emergency. And it's important to reduce the risk here and to build resilience and adapt to these changes. But at the same time, as we think about adaptation and resilience, we also need to be thinking about mitigation and going upstream at the primary source of the problem. So we can have, we need to adapt, we need to build healthy, sustainable cities, promote nature-based solutions. And for all of these interventions, we need to build public awareness, movements, and have a just transition and climate justice. So when you think about all of these elements of this issue of climate change and public health, this actually defines the organization of our book that's just been released a couple months ago. But today I'm going to only focus on the mitigation side and the health benefits of climate action across energy, transportation, and the agricultural food sector. But before I dive into the health co-benefits, just a quick update on some of the newer findings. This is not brand new, but we know that wildfires are happening more and more around the world, and this poses a particular risk. This is a study showing that fine particulate smoke from wildfires is much more harmful to children than other sources of PM. And newer studies are building on the evidence of air pollution affecting birth outcomes. And in fact, the short exposure from wildfire smoke is showing an adverse effect across pregnancies. So something that is more and more concerning as we're seeing more wildfires around the world. One other update looking at infectious diseases. In fact, this is a systematic review of human pathogenic diseases exacerbated by climatic extremes, mostly infectious diseases, but not all infectious diseases. And This review found over 1,000 pathways through which extreme climate affects our health. So pretty concerning. But I want to dive now into the health benefits of climate action, and that show how there's enormous opportunity when we look at decarbonizing the economy. And this is a rapidly growing area in environmental public health, especially as we look at climate change, because everyone realizes how urgent this is, and it's timely. I think adding the health benefits narrative can have policy move faster and further. Of course, obviously, air pollution is harmful. The latest study out of the British Medical Journal from last fall talked about over 8 million premature deaths from air pollution, of which 5.1 million premature deaths is tied to burning fossil fuels. In the food sector, we all know that unhealthy diets is harmful. And from this Lancet Commission report, they estimate that 11 million premature deaths could be avoided if we all adopted a universal healthy reference diet, which I'll show you in a later slide what that is. And finally, the transportation sector, because of our over-reliance on private motorized vehicles leading to sedentary lifestyles, that's very unhealthy. Studies show that biking and walking may avert about 4 million premature deaths every year. So if you add up these numbers, that's a lot of premature deaths, almost 20 million premature deaths that could be avoided if we could get to a fossil-free economy. We, in our own group, we've been looking in the United States at decarbonizing across sectors, and if we were to do that, we could reduce fine particulate pollution such that over 50,000 lives could be saved if we could decarbonize in the United States. And if you look at this map of the U.S., the darker blue areas are places that have the most health benefit from decarbonizing. And you can see, not surprisingly, in this region of the United States, we still have a lot of coal-fired power plants that are polluting, and so the PM from that is quite impactful. So this area would benefit greatly. But in the United States, burning electricity from burning coal is dropping tremendously, and right now the largest greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the transportation sector in the United States. Now, the fossil fuel industry, will argue, when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, we need base load, we need, fossil fuel power, or nuclear actually. But look at the price of solar. It's dropped 300-fold in the last 40 years. And so there really is no economic argument to continue to burn fossil fuels. And in fact, according to this report from the International Renewable Energy Agency, as of 2019, if you remove all subsidies from any sources of electric power, that renewables and batteries are now the cheapest way to generate electricity. So there's absolutely no reason to be burning coal. And there's no economic reason to continue with fossil fuels. Shifting gears, looking at the food sector, this is that seminal report, the Lancet Commission on Healthy Diets and Sustainable Food Systems. I'm only going to show one graph for the sake of time. This figure out of the report is showing that everything to the right of the dotted line we should not be eating. We eat way too much red meat, starchy vegetables, poultry. And if we could adopt the universal healthy reference diet, which we all know, and it's pretty much just more fruits, vegetables, whole grain, and no or little red meat, unless you're in an arid, poor country where you really do rely on your livestock for micronutrients and protein So there are places where you absolutely need to continue to eat red meat, but for wealthy countries and much of the world, this universal healthy reference diet is a target that we should go for. And if we were to adopt that, that would prevent about 11 million deaths every year, and also greatly reduce the environmental footprint, especially of growing red meat, thinking about deforestation in the Amazon and the amount of water and crops and grains grown to feed livestock. This is really would be very impactful for reducing environmental damage and improving our cardiovascular health. And finally, transportation sector. If you look at the cities in the United States with the highest rates of walking and cycling to work, you can see reduction in obesity and diabetes rates. And exercise is not just about burning calories. Contracting muscles are chemical factories promoting health, reducing heart disease, cancer, dementia, and depression. So it's extremely beneficial. We all know how important exercise is, but we need to design cities for people, not just for cars. And there are enormous health benefits to have clean mass transportation, as well as promoting exercise through bicycle and pedestrian commuting. I want to end on an even more positive note. The Inflation Reduction Act in the United States that provides $370 billion in incentives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over the next 10 years. This is the world's largest climate change legislation right now. And so it's really important because there are also health opportunities, both from the IRA and the recent infrastructure law. That is, here are some policies looking at zero emission vehicles, including electric school buses, reducing air pollution at ports, money for renewable energy facilities and efficient buildings, and programs to improve air quality monitoring in underserved populations and at schools. So within this largest climate legislation are huge opportunities for health that many people are not aware of. So I'll end by reminding everyone that planning is not accidental. And this is what Copenhagen looked like in the 1960s. And urban planners and city officials said, this is not what we want, and can we design something that's more livable? And this is what, of course, Copenhagen looks like now. And the lesson is that intentional policies make a difference for the future. So, this is why I think your meeting in Baku is really important, and I'm honored to be speaking remotely for this meeting. And with that, I'll conclude by saying that I think that the health benefits narrative can move decision makers to act, and that solving the climate crisis will greatly benefit our health as we transition to a clean energy and sustainably resourced economy. And with that, I thank you for allowing me to present from afar, and wishing you all a wonderful meeting over the next few days. Thanks again to the organizers, and take care.
Fascinating. Thanks to Professor Patz for rounding up some of the research and insights to help us better internalize what we mean when we say that tackling climate change will itself deliver huge benefits to the health of our communities. As we heard from Dr. Romanello and now from Professor Patz, we are learning more about the health effects of climate change and its causes every day. The result to change our understanding of the future scenarios and help quantify the cost of inaction, the impact on our health and wellness if we don't act immediately to reduce greenhouse gases and to build more resilient communities. But while we do know more and more about many pathways through which global warming impacts human health, there is still a lot we do not know. What about the less direct pathways? What about the less direct but equally serious ways that climate change impacts social determinants of health? What do we need to understand better in order to develop meaningful policy and direct investment to the places it can have the greatest impact? Let's listen in on conversation between two professionals who think about exactly those questions every day in order to provide better counsel to their corporate government and philanthropic clients. We'll save 5 or 10 minutes before we close this session so that you can pose questions of your own. No need to wait until we call for questions. Submit them as you have them. Those of who you here in Baku will need to make sure you have downloaded and logged into the Global Summit app. In the spirit of an inclusive hybrid event, we'll not take live questions from the ballroom. Now I'm pleased to invite Laura Herman and Aravindan Srinivasan to the stage. Laura is a partner at Dalberg Advisors who has over 20 years of experience in global health. She has worked with all kinds of partners to drive social impact. Aravindan is head of Climate Action Platform and AVPN. For these two and all other panelists at this summit, you will find full bios in the Summit app. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Laura and Aravindan.
Thank you. Mike's okay, right? Okay. Well, welcome, Laura. I think this is going to be a little bit of a different format, right? I think if you have not been scared enough in the last hour and a half about how our lives are going to look like, and it's no longer about our future generations, it's about our generations, right? Like, we are living through this. We will continue to see the effects of climate change on our own health. And, I represent AVPN. AVPN is a network of social investors across Asia. We are a member-based organization. We have about 600 members across 33 different countries, channeling capital towards all the SDG areas. And I'm in charge of our climate action platform. And we have been trying to look at ways in which we can galvanize more action, right? And that's our starting point, to see where are the donors today, where are the investors today, and how do we actually meet them where they are and start a dialogue. A lot of times when we talk about climate change, the conversation creates this false choice between mitigation and adaptation and resilience. For most economies, especially economies in Asia, this is not a dichotomy. We have to grow, we have to develop, we have to bring people out of poverty, but we also cannot do it at the cost of their lives, at the cost of their health, both in terms of the number of years of life that they have and also the quality of life that they have. APAC alone is, it has 6 out of 10 in terms of the extremity of weather events. The intensity is much higher in APAC countries. About 3.5 billion people already live in areas of stress, and 1 billion live in extreme stress. It's usually a joke in every conference, right? You start off with the most recent heat wave, and I've been to so many conferences and so many heat waves that it's no longer a data point, right? It's a numbing fact. So this is why, we have to focus, of course, on reducing emissions, but our current rate of actions are not enough to catch up to what is happening already. And this is why, as AVPN, we commissioned this piece of research to say, how do we advise our investors to move forward in such a time when things seem very daunting? And, the question, they raised around research, how much research do we need to believe that our lives are being affected? If you ask me, I've been affected already so many times that, I don't need any more research from anybody else to tell me that my life is in danger. So we have to act now. However, the question is, how do we understand the risks in front of us, and how do we take informed actions? And for me, one of the most important things was using the language that the climate community as well as the health community can understand, right? And for us, if you look at the way in which risk is qualified in the IPCC, it looks at 3 components. It looks at the climate hazards, it looks at the existing vulnerabilities, and it looks at the exposure. So in the extreme end of the spectrum, when we look at climate hazards, there are definitely a lot of these extreme weather events that happen, whose frequencies are increasing, but there are so many of these chronic events that we live with every day. So there are these dual factors that we need to take into account as we think about how do we look at assessing risk. And on the other side, exposure, like I said, especially in countries in Asia Pacific and smaller land states, the exposure is so much higher. There's a lot of exposure to the coastal communities. There's a lot of exposure in terms of the equator and the position within the equator. So for us, as we start thinking about risk, we need to look at how these 2 things interplay with the existing determinants of health. And when we come to vulnerabilities, there are of course the individual level vulnerabilities associated with demography or associated with access. There's also the system level vulnerability that we need to take into account, because most of these countries do not already have last mile access in terms of primary health care. So this is where we want to center our efforts, saying there are definitely existing pathways that are clear, pathogens. At least 80% of pathogenic activities are going to be aggravated by climate hazards. There will be so much about around 6.5 or 7 million deaths due to air pollution, NCDs including stroke, CVDs. Their risk, the severity as well as the symptom and the fatality has been going up. So these direct effects, including infectious diseases, NCDs, malnutrition, food security, water security, all of that is clear. Indirectly, even the health systems, if we look at, I think, Dr. Tedros started this and referred to this, the health workforce, they are highly exposed and we rely on them for last mile access. And during peak loads, like we saw during COVID, they cannot keep up. And now peak loads are becoming the new norm. Our health system, our primary health facilities, many of these do not have reliable, continuous power supply, and clean energy could be a very good co-benefiting space there. But also the whole supply chain that needs to be targeted, right? For example, 25% of vaccines in Bangladesh are lost in the delivery process. There's huge amount of inefficiency in the system. So for us, Laura, and this is where I'll hand it to you, we see that there is already work that is happening. There is enough evidence to say we need to start now. We can't wait for absolute perfect information. We do definitely need to invest in research. And of course, there are guided research that we could do that can help inform better programming. So this has been our experience as AVPN. I'll pass it on to you to see what has been yours.
Yeah, thanks for that. And it is lovely to be here with all of you. Thank you for the opportunity. I think the question becomes research to what end? Research to convince decision makers that this is a problem. I think that the evidence just that we saw this morning is pretty incontrovertible. At some level, research will never be enough for some. It will take other things that will drive them to act. But research that can help us to know how to act in the most efficient and effective ways, I think is very promising and critical so that resources get directed in the right manner. My worry is always that we let perfect be the enemy of the good, and we then try to think about that research at smaller and smaller levels, where I think we start to lose the forest for the trees when it comes to how to make decisions. I think the research this morning was quite sobering. It always is when we see these big meta studies. And of course, we'll talk now about additional research that has come forward as we think about health equity and this intersection with climate, and where are those opportunities for disproportionate investment that we think can really drive change for those that are most vulnerable, historically the most marginalized. And not surprisingly, many of those topics echo what has come up so far. So we can start to look at a few of those. This builds on research that Dalberg completed. We're the largest professional services firm focused on social impact globally. And we worked with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is a major funder for health in the US. And we looked at this question of what are the major trends influencing health equity around the world. Climate is probably the biggest health equity trend globally. Both directly, and we saw some of the data this morning in terms of increased heat leading to deaths, in terms of indirect impacts, droughts that drive insecurity in the food system. But looking at this from a social determinants perspective, again, helps us think about a broader tent of practitioners who also will share motivations to drive action. So I think it's important from the change we need to see for the most vulnerable, but also the process to get to that change and being more inclusive across sectors that are traditionally so siloed. Dalberg works on a range of issues, whether it's health or gender or access to energy or agriculture, and increasingly our work is like, what is that topic and how does it meet climate? And that, I think, in the words of a friend of mine, if your job wasn't a climate job yesterday, it will be a climate job tomorrow. And I think it is incumbent upon all of us to think about that connection in all of our work. So we looked at 6 global trends. Climate, of course, stands alone, but also interacts with each of those trends. And as we get into these, we can look at sort of what that means for the global community, where we're seeing action, and where we think some of those connections can be beneficial. And really this falls under the rubric of multi-solving, and many of you have probably heard that term before, but how do we multi-solve for climate and health in some of the decisions that we might make? So the first that I'll introduce is really around nutrition insecurity. And Marina touched on this, Jonathan touched on this, some of these direct impacts from droughts to flooding that leads to price shocks, decreases access. I think the monocrop approach we have is less drought resistant, so we see increased risks as a result of even how large-scale agriculture has taken on. And then, of course, Jonathan's comments at the end around the carbon intensity of animal products that come through our nutrition sector. All of these come together to imply changes at the community level. We see movements for urban agriculture, and also, of course, the policy level. And I wonder how you're seeing some of this, Aravindan, in your work when it comes to nutrition security and this interface with climate.
Yeah, so definitely this whole aspect around nutrition is a very complex one. In fact, one of the first things that we did was trying to do the math around the financing gap. And when we look at the health sector financing, we need about, at least from an APAC perspective, was about 3.5 billion, and our current financing is about $500 million. So that's a 3 billion gap. That doesn't include agri, which is a 40 billion gap. And it doesn't include water, which is another 60 billion gap, right? So these are all such large existing systems which have found a way to go deep and in the process have become verticalized. And that goes back to the point that you mentioned, research to what end, and are we influencing policymakers? Currently, the unfortunate reality is that even policymakers are siloized, right? There is no existing capacity within governments, at least within health departments of governments, to look at climate change impacts, right? The environment ministry doesn't talk to the health ministry. Even within the health ministry, there are so many different departments. So this is the part where we started, and to your point specifically on food security, there are multiple components to this, right? One is that there is so much of work happening, and Asia is the rice bowl. We contribute to so much of emissions with just by eating rice. But the current processes of cultivation, right? How much of water do we consume even in the process of creating? Even that becomes a problem. Monoculture and the way in which we have been using excessively fertilizer, especially because fertilizers get subsidies. Right? And it's a maladaptation problem. The lesser the fertility, the more fertilizer you put in, and then you're creating a pernicious cycle as well there. So it's definitely another part of the problem. Food security overall is going to be also affected by the aspect of extreme weather events actually driving people out into migration, right? And that means that lesser and lesser resources to feed more and more people who are probably going to live for longer, and also moving into other spaces which do not have the ability to provide safe and sanitation for those people. So it is a very complex problem. So when people come to us, for us, the answer is it's not a clear line. So don't look for a single silver bullet that will solve this for you. Be open to looking at it from different ways, starting from different pathways. So that's kind of how we talk about it.
Yeah, I think this will be a theme across these, that there is no silver bullet, and in fact, we need many of these sectors to come together to have true solutions. A second trend, and Marina picked up on this, that we found in our research, was this call for more public spaces, both for physical health and for mental health. And during COVID, we saw public spaces transferred to many different uses. And I think frequently we default to thinking about, public spaces, we mean parks. But in fact, we saw innovative uses of sidewalks, of alleyways, even stairways. There's interesting examples in Brazil how stairways were transformed to be effective public spaces. And here, I think, again, the interface with climate is tree cover to a certain extent, right, where we can bring down heat, we can create room for activity and physical activity outdoors, and yet they can also act as water-absorbing systems, right, to help with flood mitigation. But the climate-resilient design of those public spaces, while the world is calling for more of them, is an essential part, again, to multi-solving and putting these pieces together. We saw an interesting example in Kosovo where the community used the Minecraft app. I don't know how many of you have kids, but mine were obsessed with Minecraft for many years. And this app allowed them to design a public space to serve the community for its needs in a very inclusive approach that took into consideration some of the climate adaptation opportunities that this particular renovation afforded them. How is your work interfacing with the public spaces?
So, urban planning is a big issue in overall. I think informed urban planning, taking climate trends into account is a challenge because, like I started with, the climate and the health communities do not right now share a language. That is a challenge across levels, whether it's the private sector, whether it's the public sector, whether it's, all sorts of actions that are happening from the policy to the implementation spectrum. So for us, it is very, very important to create that ecosystem itself, right? Like, how do we get people together to talk about these issues in a way that they see it as aligned to their agendas? How do you get people to be, you use this word, in some of our conversations before. How do you get them to be more intentional about both the climate KPIs as well as the health KPIs? So it does crop up. Urban planning alone is not the only problem, but of course, urbanization in itself is a problem. Like in the case of dengue and other things, urbanization is creating more challenges, concentrating people in more, smaller and smaller and denser areas. All of that also leads to things. So again, the question is one of how do you get multi-sectoral action, right? I don't know if you've had experience in bringing, people together and getting them to work. It's a very tough job, especially as an ecosystem facilitator, right? But would love to hear your thoughts on actually bringing people together in situations like that.
Yeah, the work, and it is not easy, and you do need an instigator, right? You need someone who wants to support the process. And I think for many organizations, they are incentivized by the outcomes. But in fact, the process is long and detailed. And while many good intentions will bring people together for a meeting, a debate, to get excited about collaboration, maybe people even come to a second meeting to think about what we might do together. But if it's not someone's job to actually architect the third meeting and the plan, people drop out. Right? It's not their job to facilitate meetings. People aren't good at gathering data, right? There are many reasons why I think multi-sector collaboratives don't live to see their full promise. And frequently it's because it's happening off the sides of the desks of everyone involved without someone whose really main job it is to facilitate that set of stakeholders towards that outcome. So there's a clear opportunity for investment in more of that alignment building, creating shared strategies, agreeing on data that the different actors will share. That's always very sensitive, right? People don't want to share their data necessarily, but it's critical from a learning perspective and a course correction perspective moving through any of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, we've been asked, how do we move forward, right? For me, that is the first step in moving forward, right? Like, can we agree on a couple of basic design principles that says, if you're going to talk about an issue around nutrition, don't just get the nutrition people in the room. Get 5 people who have interests in this or contributing to this in different ways, but get them into the room and talk. So for me, and as AVPN, we've been on this journey, and we started with research here in this summit, right? We've been on this journey to say we need to democratize this because the speed at which we need to move means that there is not going to be one single actor who can, lead the charge in everything. How do we bring in the collective knowledge? How do we make real-time movement of knowledge? How do we start directing this knowledge in a very contextualized manner? And we launched this coalition called the Lighthouse because everybody, especially in every climate and health conference, everybody is just looking to the left and right and saying, okay, what do you do? Where do you start? Where do I start? And so if we are trading so much of dark waters, then the idea is if we can get people together, maybe there is also a way in which we can reduce the perception of risk involved. Right? And so that, again, goes back to the risk component, saying if we all see that this enables us to do our businesses better, then we can all move forward, because then it's in everybody's collective interest to be able to do these actions. But,
Yeah. I think that's right. I think collective work actually de-risks an issue for everyone involved, right? When you can bring the right groups together. It's a very important part of it. I do think one of the big questions is what is the role for the private sector in some of these? When it comes to nutrition insecurity, for example, many of you would have seen the WHO report last week, the commercial determinants of health, and great concern about the role of the private sector and how and in what ways does the private sector engage in these dialogues in a way that is authentic and contributes to both the social outcomes as well as, frankly, whatever their commercial objectives are going to be. Where are there ways to bring those into greater alignment? There's very healthy skepticism around where that's possible. But in fact, without the private sector, we won't get there.
Yeah.
I think on any of these, right? When you look at the scope and scale of the private sector influence through the data that Marina was just sharing, that Jonathan was just sharing, we rely on the private sector for so many of these things that we will not be able to get there without them. So that burden of figuring out how to effectively engage them beyond their cash for like charitable donations, right? That's really on the margins of the kind of contribution we'll need the private sector to make if we are to mitigate some of these risks.
Yeah.
We're, I think, at about time for questions, and so want to turn to the organizers if there are questions to pose to us. We can see them on the screens if they're coming in.
Maybe, I'll just add one point as the questions come in. For us, finally, when we advise our members, we say, look, if you're committed to this in the long term, there are three big buckets. Of course, you can start and invest in research, be very, very, very intentional about what research you're investing in. And second thing is there are already solutions. And when we did the report, we saw so many innovative solutions coming out of not just the public health or, the public health systems, but even private sector, social enterprises with a commercial business model that solve for some of these very, very hard to solve problems. And they also need support. So there's an entire spectrum of capital from just philanthropic to public financing and private financing and all sorts of blended instruments that can actually nurture solution development and scaling. And the last part is creating more spaces for the ecosystem to come together, right? So for us, it comes down to these three things, which is what we have been advising our stakeholders on. And so, if there is any questions from the audience around any of these or any other experiences, would love to take them on now.
Yeah.
Okay. So there is, okay, I'm going to have to read it while it is being typed. Maybe I'll just wait for a bit. The first question is for me. From an investor perspective, what questions do we need to ask ourselves to measure return on, thank you for zooming in, to measure return on investment when it comes to a complex issue where it is difficult to map which of the actions made a dent versus the other, beyond low-hanging fruits like GHG emissions from health system. No, that's a nice way to close it. Low-hanging fruits like GHG emissions from health system. It is not low-hanging at all, even by existing standards. But I get the question. This goes back to the comment that you made. When we are looking at firstly advising investors, the third conversation is always like, okay, where do I put the money, right? And if it is very clear and if it's very tangible, invest in this startup that is developing these cooling solutions that let's say. Workers who are in the informal sector or exposed labor can wear to reduce their body temperature. Simple, clean recommendations, they get actioned very quickly. But when you look at solutions in which we have to take a little bit of a meandering pathway, it becomes harder. So for us, the return is also in terms of loss avoided, right? Future-proofing our businesses. COVID, we saw how much of productivity loss happened, right? So for us, it's also not just about how we are improving lives right now, but it's also how much loss we are avoiding. And this quantification science is very difficult to nail down, right? I think in January, there was a good report from the World Economic Forum that showed, the quantification of the health benefits in tallies. Again, those work at a macro level, but when we come to individual investors, it becomes a problem. And one of our solutions to that has been to pool investors. The same aspect of bringing people together to say, and we have been doing philanthropic pool funds for a while to say, if we can pool investors together, people will have different priority areas and different risk appetites, but then when you get them together into a single vehicle, maybe their appetites can go up. And if we can pair that up with other forms of financing, like multilateral financing or public health financing, then there is a clear long-term view that we can give to our investors to say, if you invest in this research or the solution development, there is existing public health financing that you can tap into. That indicates a much higher leverage factor, anywhere between 6 to 8 times the initial capital that is deployed. So this is some of the ways in which we have been doing. So I'll pass it on to you.
We saw some interesting examples of blended finance in our research as well. One example was in Bogota. So a transportation investment, a transmit cable. The first one was in another part of Colombia, but in Bogota, 750,000 people live in a neighborhood that is a 2-hour commute up and down multiple mountains to get to a bus terminal, which then might ultimately take them into the center of the city for health services, for education opportunities, for work opportunities. When this cable car was put in place, the commute time went from 2 hours to 25 minutes. And the process of putting this in place involved a ton of community action, whereby they designed public spaces around each of it looks like a ski lift gondola. And so each of the major pylons that went in created a space for a plaza where they put something they call a care block in Colombia. In Bogota, they have centers where elderly and child care can happen, a whole range of services for the unpaid caregivers who support the elderly and the very young. They created community centers around these spaces. There was amazing art that was actually put on the rooftops of these buildings because you're going above them, and created an incredible sense of pride. One of the first requests from the community was paint, if we could paint these homes, and it's a gorgeous tableau as you're going up this transmit cable. And so the ROI on that for the IFC, for the government of Bogota, the government of Colombia, and other private investors is the economic opportunity for those communities, the health benefits for those communities. There's a massive parking lot at the bottom for bicycles, not for cars. An incredible lineup when you look at this space, and people keep their bikes at the bottom of the mountain, and that's how they traverse to other health benefits. There's a huge multiplex, swimming pool and fields and the other things. So yeah, there's some really interesting ROIs that go far beyond the finances of these projects.
So speaking on finances, there's a question on policies as well as finance. How do we help break down silos within government? So I can give one example, and I'll pass it on to you, Laura. We spoke about, I don't think we spoke about AMR as much today, or One Health, or some of these areas where, our interactions and engagement between food systems and the environment and us, and how that is leading to different issues. And this is one area where I think, some of the simple solutions start from, can we use surveillance and, data systems to first start by sharing different forms of data between multiple governments. So that's one way in which, very simply put, we'll say, can we aggregate data that is relevant to multiple government departments? So this is one example, and this is something that, there's been a recent mandate from the Indian government to set up this One Health Institute that can then, start piloting some of these approaches, which then can be also exported and in terms of best practice to other parts of Asia as well, because some of these issues actually transcend boundaries. It's not just within country governments, it's actually multi-country governments as well. And COVID was another example where sharing data was such a big problem, right, in the initial stages. So yeah, so those are some of the ways in which especially philanthropic capital can play a big role by creating those systems that can be open source public good systems for public health.
Yeah. I've actually recently been doing work with the Gates Foundation and a number of European governments initiating the establishment of a network for wastewater surveillance globally, which balances community level with transport hubs, so border crossings, major airports. How do you do sampling for pathogen movement globally, and then create a network effect where that data is shared for research purposes, for policy purposes. It's an extraordinary undertaking that's now kind of reached its pilot stages, so it'll be exciting to see where that goes.
There's another question maybe for you, I think, Laura, around
Yeah, the private sector.
the private sector.
Yeah, so really appreciate this question. When I've done work that centers this question of aligning private incentives with public goals, frequently we come at it from the corporate perspective. How does corporate strategy actually need to change to look for the economic benefits of driving that social impact? And where you can find those, you're not at the whim of the CEO's pet project, right? And like some of the big philanthropic efforts that a company might take on. When those are very divorced from the commercial strategy, they're very vulnerable to shifts in leadership and, frankly, the kind of flavor of the day. And that leads us to corporate capital being pulled in and out of different issues and really undermining the sustainability of the investments they might make. When we can align it with corporate strategy, long-term strategy, we see a lot of promise for starting to bring these together. But it does depend on a primacy on long-term economic value creation as opposed to short-termism. And I think that's one of the hurdles that every CEO wrestles with, and increasingly we need our capital systems to reward even more to incentivize that long-term outlook. But I see we are almost at time. Any last word you'd add on what you've seen with the private sector?
One of the examples I'll just close with this is, because we are, as AVPN dealing a lot with, social investment and philanthropic capital, a lot of times the champions behind this philanthropic capital are business families.
Yeah.
So that is one way where, for example, in Indonesia, Srinivasan has been a big champion of climate change. That there's a big industry body themselves, but they are the ones actually creating these spaces, providing support to the government themselves. So, influential individuals like those could also be a good force to actually get business, because they can, straddle both worlds and they speak both the languages, and they have the connections within the government and the influence to be able to actually align incentives as well. So I think engaging with those kind of influential people will also be one of the ways in which we try to do this work. Yeah.
Agreed.
Time's up from me. I don't know if you had any closing comments.